Tell me if this sounds like natural English. I watched my mom as she dragged the trash can to the curb. I wanted to help her. I exclaimed to her, "You should have asked me. I would have helped you." Not quite. It's not quite natural English, and that's because I followed all the rules for ed endings. Wait, if I followed all the rules, why didn't I sound natural? Because Americans do all sorts of crazy things with the T and D sounds. This is video 2 in our series on ed endings, regular past tense verbs. If you didn't see video 1, don't worry, you're going to be okay. We're going to not just learn the pronunciation rules, but the pronunciation habits of Americans, so you can sound totally natural speaking in the past tense in American English. And remember, if you like this video or you learned something new, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe with notifications. It helps a lot. This is the second video, and we're going to dive deep into Rule 2. I'll do a 10-second recap of the rules. Rule 1. If the sound at the end of the infinitive is unvoiced, ed is pronounced t, walked. Rule 2. If it's voiced, the ed is pronounced d. Agreed, seemed. Rule 3. If that last sound is T or D, the ed ending is id, needed, painted. Was that 10 seconds or was it longer? So, Rule 2. The last sound in the infinitive is a voiced sound. What is a voiced sound? All vowels and diphthongs are voiced, and some consonants. First, we'll talk about vowels and diphthongs. For example, the word agree ends in the E vowel, agree. Past tense would be agreed with the D sound, agreed. Now you probably learned that D is pronounced D, a stop of air voicing the vocal cords D, D, and then a release, agreed. But we actually have a couple of different pronunciations that we'll use for these Rule 2 ed endings. Let's look at the phrase, I agreed it would be a good idea. Agreed it. Agreed it. Agreed it. Agreed it. That's a flap of the tongue. It's not a stop of air. It's actually just like the flap T, if you're familiar with that sound. The D between vowel or diphthong sounds is a quick single flap of the tongue against the roof of the mouth. Agreed it. Agreed it. Agreed it. So anytime with these ed endings that you have the sounds of a vowel or diphthong, D, and then a vowel or diphthong, it's a flap. Agreed it. Lied about. Lied about. Lied about. Lied about. What if the next word doesn't begin with a vowel or diphthong, but rather a consonant? Let's take a look at the example agreed with. I agreed with you. I agreed with you. It's not a fully pronounced D because there's no release. That would be this. I agreed with you. I agreed with you. Agreed with. Agreed with. We don't do that. We don't do that release. When the next word begins with a consonant, we make the noise in the vocal cords, but we don't release it. We go right into the next sound, in this case, W. Agreed with. Agreed with. Agreed. It's the sound, but there's not a stop and release. We just carry that voiced D right into the W. Agreed with. Agreed with. We like to make English really smooth, and that's why in these cases, stop consonants are not fully pronounced. Let's look at a few more examples where we have a vowel or diphthong, then the D, and then the next word begins with a consonant. He sued the company. Sued the. Sued the. Do you hear that D in the vocal cords? He sued the company. Plowed through. Plowed through. Weighed my options. Weighed my options. Now let's look at a few more examples. You tell me how the ed ending should be pronounced. Flapped or unreleased. The next word begins with a consonant sound, so this D is unreleased. Toyed with. Toyed with. Toyed with. Let's go to Youglish for an example.
And I even toyed with calling the movie Liberty for a little while. Toyed with.
Can you say that now really easily with that unreleased D sound, toyed with? Toyed with. What about this one? Is the D flapped or unreleased? Reviewed-a. Reviewed-a. That's usually going to be a flap because the D comes between two vowel or diphthong sounds. Reviewed-a. Reviewed-a. Let's go to Youglish for an example.
It's what people said when they came from abroad, reviewed a place. Reviewed.
One more. What about this one? Booed by. The next word begins with a consonant, so that will be an unreleased D. Booed by. Vibrating the vocal cords, making the D sound, but not releasing. Booed by. Let's look at an example.
I got booed by 20,000 people, for those that don't know, in 2012.
So for Rule 2, we looked at vowel and diphthongs plus ED. What about all the consonants that are voiced? That's still Rule 2, and things start to get a little more complicated. We'll look at each of these voiced consonant endings. Let's start with R, like in the word fired. He was fired last week. Fired last, not D, a release. That would be fired last, but it's fired last. That unreleased D sound in the vocal cords before the next consonant. If the next word begins with a vowel or diphthong, the D will be flapped, but only because of the R. The rule for flapping is a D or T will be flapped between two sounds that are vowels and diphthongs, or if the first sound, the sound before is an R, and the sound after is a vowel or diphthong, like in the word party or hardy. Those are both flaps because of the R, DT, vowel diphthong pattern. Party, hardy. So when we have an ending R infinitive plus the D sound plus a word that begins with a vowel or diphthong, that D will be flapped. It's not like this for any of these other voiced consonants. It's just because of the R. He was fired on Monday. Fired on. Da-da-da-da. Single flap of the tongue. Fired on. And I should say for any of these Rule 2 words, if the next word is you or your, a native speaker might turn that D into a J sound. We do this with any word that ends in a D when the next word begins with you or your, like in the phrase, would you? Would J sound. Would you? Would you do that for me? J. So all of these words in Rule 2 do end in a D sound, therefore you might hear this happen. Let's take fired you as an example. Fired you.
You know, they fired you and you were poor for 2 years. Fired you. Fired you.
Fired you. Fired you. J, with that J sound. How about G, another voiced consonant, like in the word beg? Begged. She begged all the time. When the next word begins with a vowel or diphthong, you will release that D into the next word, begged all the time. Doll, begged all the time. But when the next sound is a consonant, it gets more complicated. Honestly, there are 3 ways you might hear it. First, dropped. I begged for a dog when I was a little kid. Beg for. I dropped it there. Or you might hear that unreleased D sound in the vocal cords. I begged for a dog. Begged for a dog. Begged for a dog. Or you might even hear a light release. I begged for a dog. Begged. Light release. I begged for a dog. Let me show you what I mean. We'll go to Youglish. Now in this one, I hear the D in the vocal cords, but not released. Begged for.
That he begged for quarters in the park across the street. Begged for quarters. Begged for quarters.
In this next one, I don't really hear any D. I think it's dropped.
The rebels begged for food at homes along the way. Begged for food. Beg for food.
And now an example where the D is lightly released.
I begged for an interview. Begged for an interview. Begged for an interview.
Like I said in my Rule 1 video, try not to get stressed out about there being more than one option. If it's easier for you to always lightly release your D, that's okay. As you get more used to English and you're around a lot of native speakers, or if you're doing a lot of imitating, you may find that you start dropping the D sound more naturally. What we're doing here is looking at all the different possibilities and pronunciations of what you'll hear when speaking with Americans. When a word ends in the J sound, like in change, I just listened to a bunch of examples of changed. Let's listen to a few.
Life changed pretty rapidly for the worse.
Little by little things changed.
So all those had the released D, changed. But it can definitely be dropped too. Let's look at a common phrase, changed my mind, changed my. It's fairly common to drop the ED ending there. The more common a phrase is, the more likely we'll do some sort of reduction there. And that's what I found often happens here. I changed my mind becomes I changed my mind. I listened to a lot of phrases and the D was almost always dropped. So it just sounds like the present tense. Change my mind, even though it's past tense. Here are some examples.
But I've changed my mind about stress.
Change my mind. When I listen in slow motion, I don't hear any kind of D.
I've changed my mind.
Here are a few more with that dropped D.
Kind of still feel like a loser because I changed my mind.
Yes.
I changed my mind. I changed my mind.
I've changed my mind a number of times after hearing the oral argument. I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind.
God appears to Schleyer and says, I changed my mind about that confounded speech thing. I changed my mind. I changed my mind.
What about a word where the last sound in the infinitive is the L, like in the word drill? When it's followed by a word that begins with a vowel or diphthong, release the D into that word to link it. Drilled into, drilled into. Let's look at some examples where the next word begins with a consonant.
Each hole has been drilled to fit a certain nut shape. Drilled to fit. Drilled to fit.
Drilled to. The D made in the vocal cords, drilled to. It's not released, we just go right into the T sound. If I released it, it would be drilled to, drilled to. But it's drilled to, drilled to. Listen again.
Each hole has been drilled to fit a certain nut shape. Drilled to fit. Drilled to fit.
Another example.
We have all these drilled but uncompleted wells. Drilled but. Drilled but.
Drilled but. Drilled but. I did hear the D released lightly. Drilled but. This next one was tricky for me. I had to really slow it down to hear if there is an unreleased D or not. I think there is.
There's more holes being drilled. We're starting to see some more sales tax come in. Drilled, restart. Drilled, restart.
The most common pronunciation I was hearing in various situations was an unreleased D. Now we'll cover our three nasal consonants, M, N, and NG. For M, we'll look at the word bummed. That means disappointed. We often use it without. I'm so bummed out. Now in that case, because the next word begins with a diphthong, we link with the D. Doubt, doubt, bummed out, bummed out. I'm so bummed out. Let's listen to an example of that one.
It was about a full day of just being down and bummed out. Bummed out. Bummed out.
Doubt, doubt, bummed out. Now we'll hear two examples where bummed is followed by a consonant. First, it's dropped, and that's more common, and then you'll hear it where it's released.
See, she's probably just bummed that she's not in the center of attention. Bummed that she's
Bummed that. I didn't hear that D at all. That D was dropped. Here it's released.
And so we were bummed for a couple of days until bummed for. A light release of the D. You know, I haven't been talking about much when these ed ending words are at the end of a thought group. There, it will usually be a light release. Let's look at an example.
So I was bummed. So I was bummed.
Bummed. Light release. That's a fun word, isn't it? I'm feeling bummed. I'm kind of bummed out. Or you can use it as a noun. It's a bummer. Oh shoot, my favorite restaurant is closed today. I wanted to eat there. That's a bummer. N. N is kind of special. N can make a T silent. Do you know this rule? When T comes after an N, it's not uncommon to drop that T, like in the word internet or interview. When D comes after an N and before another consonant, it's pretty common to drop, like in grand piano. So it's really common to drop the D sound in these ed endings when the sound in the infinitive, the final sound was N, and the next word begins with a consonant. Let's look at several examples. These are all with the word signed.
The contracts that we sign with virtual employees state very clearly, we sign with.
The result was that he had only signed 10% of his paintings. Sign 10.
Of all the different laws of the country, put it on one document signed by an EO and signed by.
All with a dropped D. Now we'll look at drained. Also all dropped Ds here.
You know, the political philosophers have sort of drained the life out of him to some extent. Drain the life.
We see what we've done is we've drained the water down in this basin. Drain the water.
The American soldier has drained deep the chalice of courage. Drain deep. Drain deep.
And as always, when the next word begins with a vowel or diphthong, we'll use the released D to link in, like in this example.
I signed into law the Global Food Security Act. Signed into law. Signed into law.
Signed into. Dinda, with that D sound linking. At the end of a sentence, we'll probably release that D. What about NG? Well, we don't have many words here. A lot of those NG ending verbs are not regular, like ring, rang, sing, sang. But we do have the word long, longed. The noun is longing, and this means to yearn for, to have a strong desire for. I longed for my mother's attention. Or I longed for my newborn baby when I was at work. Or I longed to be taken seriously. This is often followed by for, which of course begins with a consonant. The ed ending can be dropped, but also this is an emotional word, and it will sometimes be more stressed. I longed for acceptance. And in these cases, the D will probably be lightly released. We'll hear two examples, first where it's dropped, and then when it's not.
Spanish, soledad, which longed for them. Longed for them. Longed for them.
The limited technical approaches that were available. I longed for the advantages of a microorganism. Longed for.
Let's move on to the voiced TH. This is another sound that's not very common in ed ending words. We have smoothed, bathed.
These words will most often be followed by a word that begins with a vowel, like smoothed out, or smoothed over, or bathed in. We'll lightly release the D into that next sound. But when the next sound is a consonant, it's much easier to drop the ED ending to connect. Here are 3 examples dropping the ED ending with the word smoothed.
You might say, well, maybe things just smooth themselves out. Smooth themselves. Smooth themselves.
The other thing we did is that we smoothed the profile. We
and smooth things out. So I'm waiting. Smooth things out. Smooth things out.
The V sound, like in moved his car. Moved his. There I dropped the H in his, that's a common reduction. And so the D linked into the I sound because that's a vowel. Moved his, diz. I moved his car. At the end of a sentence, we'll probably release that D. He moved. He moved. But when the next sound is a consonant, you'll hear both dropped and lightly released. Here are 2 examples. In the first, the D is released. Moved me. In the second example, it's dropped.
That insight is what moved me to write my book, The True American. Moved me. Moved me.
Before she moved back to Mexico. Move back. Move back.
Words where the infinitive ends in Z, like buzzed. The rules are the same. Release D into a vowel or diphthong, like in buzzed about.
Which is one of the most buzzed about companies in education today. Buzzed about. Buzzed about.
Buzzed about means really talked about. There's a lot of interest about something. At the end of a thought group, it will likely be released, like here.
And she buzzed. Buzzed. Buzzed.
And when the next word begins with a consonant, you'll have either dropped or lightly released ending. Here's an example where it's released.
My phone buzzed with a text message telling me buzz, buzz.
And where the ED ending is completely dropped.
Oh, my husband came home a little buzzed last night. Buzz last night. Buzz last night.
We have one more sound here for rule 2, and it's the zh sound. It's not at all common to have a verb that ends with zh plus ed, but we do have barraged. Barraged means to bombard, aggressively throw something at someone. And it might not mean physically throw. You can barrage someone with words, or someone can feel barraged with emails. They just keep getting too many emails. They can't keep up. This word is usually followed by with or by, but you might hear barraged us, followed by a vowel, so you'll link with the D. They barraged us with phone calls. Dus. Barraged us. Barraged us. At the end of a sentence, I'll lightly release it. I was completely barraged. But followed by a consonant, it will likely be dropped.
We're barraged by it. Everywhere we go, we're barraged by paper. We're barraged by it. We're barraged by it. We're barraged by it. We're barraged by it.
Or lightly released.
I was just barraged with questions.
Whew, that is a lot for Rule 2, isn't it? The pronunciations of the ED ending depend on the sounds before and after. And the more you study and watch examples on Youglish or TED Talks, the more you'll get used to how Americans pronounce the ED endings, and you'll be able to smooth out your own speech and sound natural. Now, let's have you train with some of these Rule 2 cases with a dropped D to make that feel more comfortable for you. First, you'll hear a phrase. Then you'll hear just the 2-word link
in slow motion twice, 3 times, repeat the 3rd time. It's important to not just learn something, but to actually train it, to speak out loud, to get used to it.
I got booed by 20,000 people, for those that don't know, in 2012.
Beg for food. Beg for food. Beg for food.
But I've changed my mind about stress. I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind.
Kind of still feel like a loser because I changed my mind?
Yes.
I changed my mind. I changed my mind. I changed my mind.
I've changed my mind a number of times after hearing the oral argument. I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind.
God appears to Schleyer and says, I changed my mind about that confounded speech thing. I changed my mind. I changed my mind. I changed my mind.
See, she's probably just bummed that she's not in the center of attention. Bummed that she's
The contracts that we sign with virtual employees state very clearly, we sign with.
The result was that he had only signed 10% of his paintings. Sign.
Of all the different laws of the country, put it on one document signed by an EO that empowered the Department of Homeland Security.
You know, the political philosophers have sort of drained the life out of him to some extent. Drain the life.
We see what we've done is we've drained the water down in this basin. Drain the water. Drain the water. Drain the water.
The American soldier has drained deep the chalice of courage. Drain deep. Drain deep. Drain deep.
You might say, well, maybe things just smooth themselves out. Smooth themselves. Smooth themselves. Smooth themselves.
The other thing we did is that we smoothed the profile. We smoothed
You figured things out a little bit and smoothed things out. So I'm waiting to smooth things out. Smooth things out. Smooth things out.
Before she moved back to Mexico. Move back, move back, move back.
Oh, my husband came home a little buzzed last night. Buzzed last night. Buzzed last night. Buzzed last night.
We're barraged by it. Everywhere we go, we're barraged by paper. We're barraged by it. We're barraged by it. We're barraged by it.
I plugged the probe into my phone.
They came and did the stage reading.
We actually enrolled the company. company.
Of course, he blamed the press. He blamed the.
It is now day 2, and I've strained the broth. I've strained the
potatoes. I strained.
Do you feel you were wronged by Conference USA not being able to host in your final year? Wrong, but.
They solved the problem they have called cash flow. They solved the.
I did not expect Rule 2 to take this long. We're going to save Rule 3 for another video coming out in a few weeks. While you wait for that next video, be sure to check out this video. Also, check out my online courses at Rachel's English Academy. You'll become a more confident English speaker. I make new videos every Tuesday. Be sure to come back next week to watch more. I love being your English teacher. That's it, and thanks so much for using Rachel's English.